Okay, I think we'll get started now. Um, Thanks again, everyone, for attending to this morning's webinar. It's going to be a bit of a drinking from a fire hose, a Reader's Digest version of a webinar. We're going to do 20 minutes of facts and information. And today's webinar is really going to focus on the technology trends that we're seeing in mobile in particular. This webinar was really inspired by the last 6 to 8 to 10 months of us working with hotels and yourselves as our partners to really implement mobile technology solutions. And as we've been learning, we thought, why don't we just share this with everybody and get that feedback? So that's today's presentation. It's going to be myself on as your host from RoomKeyPMS. And I also have on the line here is Margot, who works with our team, and she'll be assisting with QA. One of the things that I wanted to note as we go is you notice a little QA box in the bottom of your chat screen. Please feel free to fire in questions there as we go, anything that pops up. And at the end of the presentation for the last 10 minutes, we're going to focus on answering as many of those questions as we can. Anything that we don't answer, we'll respond to by email directly. So with that, let's jump right in. So I really wanted to ground this webinar today in as many facts as I could find to really set the tone for the guest behavior that we're seeing in the world. So what I did is I grabbed data from as many places as I could find. Citron had Crichton had some great studies in the last year or so, Hotel Technology News, Hotel Executive, CETA, and basically these statistics looked at around 3,000 to 4,000 travelers in total, and we had reports that ranged all of 2020. I found data that looked at around 80% of the individuals were traveling one or more times per year, so we had a decent set of travelers. About 50% of this group was leisure. And of course, it slanted more that way as we went into 2020, and a pretty good subset of stars. So we had about 50% in 1 to 3 star hotels and 50% in 4+ star hotels. And then what I did is I broke the data into really 3 major buckets. And it was around the question of how likely are you to use certain technologies. And I really looked at 3 buckets: the check-in and check-out stats, the in-stay stats, and the app general stat, which I think is an important question that's being posed. So when looking at the check-in and check-out stats, one of the things that was the first question was, how likely are you to use mobile check-in? So early in 2020 and late 2019, the stats that I found were more in the 70% range and 76% range. But later in 2020, we saw a continued push towards higher percentage of people willing to use mobile check-in. And one of the most recent studies I found had it at 92% over 3,000 or so travelers. The other question is, what is your likelihood to use digital door keys? And we found that generally, even prior early 2020 through to late 2020, this was still a high number. It went from 71% to 73%, which is still not as much of a material change, but I mean, anything over 70% I thought showed a real likelihood. The other one that came up later in 2020 in stats, this wasn't as early on, is, are you willing to pay your bill using a mobile app or some sort of digital process? So 82% said they were likely on that front. And the final one that I wanted to uncover is the ongoing questions around mobile versus kiosk and where does that play into it. So the best stats that I could find suggested that the use of a public kiosk, or the likelihood of using a public kiosk, is 8 to 10%. I was a little surprised at that. I expected this to be a higher percentage, but that is the data. The next category that I looked at was in-stay. What stats are important? What are people likely to look for while they're in stay? So 77% were interested in browsing local information. 75% would make a restaurant booking through an app or a digital medium. 47% are more likely to order room service if they had that control. And the final stat for in-stay was around, I was looking for something on live chat and interaction, and 45% said they would use live chat. So I actually expected that to be higher also. So I was a little surprising that, so it might suggest there's something going on there with the consumer behavior of live chat. And the final one here on apps, which I thought was interesting, that stood out to me, is 73 to 80%, and this is from early in 2020 to late till 2020, so it definitely went up, would be willing to download an app for their favorite hotel. But I thought this question was interesting, as people were stating that they were willing to do it for their favorite hotel. So those were some of the key stats that I found in terms of where mobile is going and how guests' behavior is changing. So the takeaways for me from this, when I step back and try to come up with some conclusions, I think that guests want choice and control at all stages of the guest experience. And I think we've seen this in many industries, but I think this stats also tells that story. I think guests want to use their own devices. I think, devices have been ubiquitous for years, but I think especially during COVID, the safety of having your own device just became paramount. So I think that rang true in the stats. Um, I think the point that needs to be said too is I do feel like there's this uncertainty around kiosks. There's a willingness and there could be an interest to explore that, but there's also this uncertainty. So it's sort of a balancing act, I think, in the stats. I also think there's a desire to work with real staff in situations at the hotel. I think when people say they only want to use 45% for chat, I think one of the things you can read into that is they're still looking for that connection with real staff combined with technology. And I'm going to elaborate on that as a little bit more as we go. So as I dug deeper into this and I went, okay, that's great. We have stats. Now let's take a look at RoomKeyPMS's stats. What's our data telling us? And so we're able to pull this directly from our systems and come up with some conclusions. So what data are we looking at here? We're looking at around, over the last 8 months, we've rolled out mobile check-in, check-out, and various mobile pieces over about 76 hotels. The hotels themselves are around 25 to 135 rooms. That's sort of the range of hotels. And so from this group, we were able to see the experiences of about 17,000 users over this time period. So what did that tell us? So one of the main questions I wanted to answer is, it's great that people are using these technologies. Are they actually completing the process? So completing the process of check-in or check-out means the hotel's getting value or the guests getting value, or we can at least, infer that that's what's taking place. So I started pulling some completion percentages and I took a range of hotels and this is what I found. You had everything from 37% conversion or in completing the process all the way up to 82%. So when I saw 67%, 82%, to be honest, I was really surprised. I expected success was going to be 20%, 30%. That was our internal goal. So when hotels were doing 82%, we knew we had to dig into these properties and find out, what are they doing? What's working? How are they making this so successful? And across all properties, we were looking at around 42% conversion. So also better than expected. And now, time will tell, and that's the learning process that we're going through is as the world changes, how do these stats change? And we'll continue to watch them. The other one that I thought was really interesting was just looking at the behavior of people on mobile devices. So I think the interesting stats here are that on average, people were going through 4 to 5 pages and sessions to interact with the mobile check-in or checkout experience. I think the most interesting one is that they're spending on average 3 minutes to 4 minutes on these applications. And I think it's because there's actually an engagement here, that this is for someone to sit down on their mobile device and kind of go through these steps is a very natural form of engagement and a very easy form of engagement. And I think in a lot of ways, you might be getting more engagement here than you're getting in your website at different times during the stay cycle, if you look at just the numbers of how many minutes. So I thought that was really interesting. So when I step back from this, I wanted to do one other snapshot is, that's our stats. I looked at general stats from other sources. What's happened in the world in terms of self-serve in the last, couple decades? And are there some common themes that I can pull from that? So I looked at 3 groupings. I looked at bank, I looked at movie theaters, and I looked at airlines. And banks go all the way back to the 1970s. So we're talking 40 years now of self-serve technology development there. Movie theaters in the 90s and airlines in the 2000s. And I thought, what were the common trends? Why did they do this? And the great thing about these old industries is they have lots of case studies that have been done on them. So why did banks do it? And this is what's interesting because it's going to resonate. It's the same as what's happening in the hotel world. They did it to shorten teller queues. And they also did it because it benefited their business. They knew that they could transact more with their customers because they weren't restricted by bank hours anymore. They could now do transactions, be taking deposits, which is great for a bank. And then on the movie theater side, digging into similar studies, what did it tell me? Shorter ticket queues was the reason they did it. Increased concession revenue, that they could bundle things at the right time of when someone's having that transaction mindset, and they could reduce labor costs. And then when I carried that forward to the 2000s, we saw the same thing. 23% of airlines said they reduced costs. 21% said they were able to reduce staff based on the increasing, in relation to the increased number of flights and travel that was taking place. So I thought that was really interesting. And it really also tells me that, this is 40 years of self-serve. And so where do hotels fit into that timeline? What's next? So a couple takeaways that I took when I looked at these studies is that I think I would add on is ease of use is key for the adoption. And we're going to talk about some of those best practices. But if you imagine back to ATMs, in banks, the original versions, for those of you that were around using them, the airlines, you can see these have gone through many iterations over that time period. And ease of use is key. I think the other thing we're seeing here is that all of these industries are aggressively moving to mobile. If you think about your experience of kiosks with them in the early days compared to what you're doing on mobile, it's really slanting that way. But I think it's fair to say the kiosks are always going to be part of the experience, depending on the experience you want to provide your guests. The final thing here that I don't think should be lost at any point here is that human interaction is not taken away in this process. Human interaction and monitoring is absolutely essential for great self-serve, which seems kind of counterintuitive. And I think of the Bengals or that wrote the song "Video Killed the Radio Star," and they always thought that MTV movies are going to kill the radio, and then people thought the internet was going to kill the TV. None of these things actually completely kill the other. They just work in collaboration. And I think this will be very much true for self-serve. Self-serve will be a combination of self-serve and very much hotel staff assisting people with self-serve at various different points. So let's jump there. I'm going to switch right over into the tips and best practices as to what we're seeing. Like, what did the best hotels do to ultimately achieve these high conversion rates? So to do that, I'm going to look at the mobile guest life cycle, basically from pre-arrival to check-in to departure, and talk about just a few tips in each. We could actually dig into each one, and I plan to do more webinars where we talk about some of these stats. So let's talk about pre-arrival. Most important thing on pre-arrival is to ensure an easy check-in process is when you send them the communication to check in, it needs to have one single action. It's very tempting at this point to provide paragraphs of marketing information and talk about the hotel and various different things. There's a time and place for that in a separate communication. But for check-in itself, you want to focus on what the guest is trying to achieve in their goal. One single option. We found this alone increased the difference of this being convoluted versus simple, change the conversion rate up to 15 to 25% in the check-in process. The second thing that's really important here is don't restrict yourself to one channel to get them to check in. Not just email, not just SMS, do both, and do it on the day of arrival. It needs to be timely and relevant. That also made a big difference for the hotels that performed the best in our study. Another thing that I think is important here is that as we saw in the stat, people are interested in downloading an app for their favorite hotel. But for the most part, when people are checking in and they haven't even arrived at your property, they're not yet willing to make that extra investment of downloading an app. So make sure this first check-in option has a web-based version. So this means they can grab it on their tablet, they can grab it on the web, they can grab it on the phone. Doesn't really matter, they can do it quickly. And that ties into this last piece, which is make sure that when they click these links, that they're already logging them in. It's securely passing them through into the system to complete their check-in. Making someone look for reservation information and things like this is going to lower that conversion ratio. So this is, a couple simple steps. And I'm going to reiterate this because this is probably one of the most important things for the success of the mobile check-in, check-out process. The next that I want to touch on in check-in is it's very tempting early to ask for a lot more information. Ask for birthdays, ask for key information that lets you bulk up your CRM information for future marketing. That information is absolutely essential for future marketing, but it's information overload at the time of mobile check-in. If you ask for a lot of those extra things, it's going to become it's going to decrease that conversion rate. So I think it's important to focus on what's important in terms of collecting data. I think one other thing to think about here is ask for their email. Make sure you're asking for their email. Give them an opportunity to swap out that generic OTA email address so you can get a great piece of contact information stored in your system. This is a really natural point for them to make this change, where if they otherwise were coming to the front desk and you were trying to make this change, that would be a painful time to make it. This is a very natural, fluid time to make that change. So something to keep in mind. I think a good tip that we learned. So the next piece that I wanted to touch on that, was good feedback from our hotels, and we've seen the benefit, is when they get to the pre-arrival point, ask for their credit card. When you're working with a complete mobile credit card integration, you're able to get, you potentially already have a card on file, but this allows you to get another card. And the great thing about this is it allows you to check early now if this is a valid card, and collect more than one card. So this is potentially securing that revenue for your property, and more importantly, this can help reduce fraud because we're actually able to validate at this stage that that's a legitimate card. The next part of the credit card process, which I think is important, is ask for a digital signature. Again, this is something that when someone's doing a quick check-in process over a few minutes, it's very fluid to ask for that signature. But it allows you to arm yourself for chargebacks in the future. By collecting that signature allows for a completely digital registration card, but you actually get more information than you would get if you were doing this with a wet signature, as they say, on a piece of paper, where you're actually collecting the date they signed, also their IP address, more information you can use in the future in the chargeback process, which I think is good for hotels. Next thing that I wanted to just touch on high level is digital keys. As we saw the stat, there's a willingness to move towards digital keys, and we're seeing more and more digital key adoption. I wouldn't say it's the make or break of the mobile check-in, checkout experience, but I think as time passes, it's going to become the mainstay of that key experience. So one thing to think about here is, I think just start to think about, do you have Bluetooth enabled locks? Is that in your budget? Are you thinking about it this year? Are you thinking about it next year? But at least to be starting to explore it and understand it. And I think another best practice we learned here in implementing this is that it's not going to be only mobile keys or only physical keys. It's going to be a combination of keys. So make sure that that process of being able to work with your guest at the front desk allows you to trigger a mobile key for them or cut a key. It needs to be flexible. So just something to think about, and something we learned going through this process. Jumping over to departure, I'm really just going to reiterate a lot of the same points in terms of this. We're finding the same thing, that you want to get an email and SMS out on the same day of checkout, and you also want to have one action here, just checkout. Simple click, simple view their bill. The simpler this is, the more likely checkout is going to be smooth and easy in terms of the mobile experience. Which brings me to the same point on that side of things is, again, making sure that you allow the user at the time of checkout to enter a new credit card, or use their credit card on file. Again, it's another point of security on collecting that revenue, validating that card, and so on. And also at the same time, collecting that signature again. So now you're completing the digital paper trail that's going to allow you to, potentially address chargebacks in the future, but also have a really clean, basically, chain of legal agreement on your transaction. One of the things that we're seeing in mobile technologies and PMS systems with mobile technologies is the idea of the automated checkout, which I think is something to consider, or at least start to. I think part of this is a partnership in changing operation procedures and see how this could work, is the ability, for example, when somebody completes the mobile checkout, that it will actually complete the payment on the folio, close it out, and fully check the guest out and release the room. So this can all be an automated process where you can monitor it and see it, and potentially freeing up time to focus on other things. One of the big points that I was making earlier is about this combination of self-serve, but also tied with being able to monitor it and assist your guests in this process. And this is where I think, especially on the property management system side, property management systems will continue to evolve into being almost a window into the self-serve experience. So I'm going to use a screenshot here to convey this. But basically, what I think is really important here, and you'll see from these two boxes, is that when you're going into your screens and you're looking at arrivals or you're looking at departures, you're looking at statuses of guests, the statuses of guests will no longer be face-to-face all the time, but you need to know where that guest is at. So for example, you need to ensure that there's the iconography to say, hey, this person checked in. I didn't see that, but they did it. This is their estimated time of arrival. This is some notes that, because I hadn't talked to them, but it's easily accessible. And the same for checkout, that you want to be able to see that quickly visually. Oh, okay, all the guests completed checkout on their own. They actually completed payment, so they've been automatically checked out. Is there any action for me as the front desk staff? Is there a task for me to take on? I think those are the things that are really important. The visual monitoring of this. This is the change in sort of some of the best practices. Okay, so with that, I was going to talk really quickly about some of the things that we're working on right now, but what I'd love to do is show everybody a quick poll to get a sense of what are the things that are important for all of you around hotel technologies in 2021. So I'm going to launch a poll here, and we're going to do about 60 seconds where just answer the top 3. What are the things that you are finding the most important right now? So everybody should see that poll now. And just fire away. What are the things that are for your property in 2021 that are just really key, that you value the most? And then I'll share the results with everybody, and we'll just see where it falls. Okay, results are coming in fast and furious. We'll give everyone about 30 more seconds. It's interesting. We have a clear winner emerging. I can keep everybody in suspense. Probably can guess it. Okay, I'll give it 10 more seconds. There's about 20 more people, 50 more people to vote. If you're able to fire in a few. Okay. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. So I hope everybody's seeing the results, but the clear winner here is mobile check-in and checkout, 88%. That was the big winner. Second to that, we had mobile ID and photo verification was at 38%. Actually, mobile payment was 54%. I take that back. That was number 2. Mobile ID and photo verification was next, with digital keys next, and mobile guest messaging. Those are kind of the biggest buckets. It's interesting, kiosk fell at 4% down to not so far from what we saw in the stats. And mobile room service and restaurant ordering also pretty small. So anyway, that was great. Thank you guys very much. That's great information for us. And, starts to tie in with, I was just going to touch briefly here on this, and then we'll jump to questions. But, the things that we've been focused on is a lot of the things that you're seeing here today. And this is sort of the shameless promotion part of our webinar. Is we've really been focusing on automating. We just launched mobile checkout, some digital key integrations, just launched SMS. And now we're actually working on the front desk mobile piece to a degree. So it's interesting. So we'll have to do a bit more digging into the kiosk piece, and then upselling is next in our roadmap. So excited to be working on those things and doing these webinars to get feedback from everybody. So with that, I'm going to jump to Q&A now. We have about 5 minutes to take a few questions. And then, like I said, any questions that we miss, we'll definitely fire back to everybody, answers, and also a copy of this video. Margot, are there any questions that stand out that you could throw out?
Yes, I just unmuted myself. That works better. So we have a question here from an independent hotel, predominantly transient traveler, and they're wondering, and have not previously used technology for check-in, check-out. So how would they go about notifying and encouraging guests to use this technology?
The main way to get this information out to guests is going to be, really at the time of reservation, collecting their email address. So if you're getting a reservation through your website, you're collecting their email address and phone number. That allows for the email and the SMS. Also, if you're getting reservations from the OTAs, Booking.com, Expedia, and so on, even though that generic email address is coming through, it is allowing us, for the most part, to communicate back with that guest immediately. And so the system itself will actually send these emails and SMSs automatically to guests on the day of arrival. So the goal is, as long as you're using those standard channels of collecting information on email and phone, then the system is automatically doing this and engaging your guests to get them into the checkout process. The other thing you're seeing out there a lot now is QR codes. So it could be a QR code in the lobby or a sign in the lobby that's letting someone see the URL, the vanity URL that says hotel X and Y /check-in, and they're jumping to that while they're in the lobby, or using the QR code to trigger this screen to jump into it. So those are probably the primary methods we're seeing.
I would add to that as well, Tim, if I may. If you want to encourage as well your guests well in advance to use that mobile technology, tools like a CRM as well, and text messaging platforms can also be a way for you to keep reminding them or educate them in advance, letting them know that you have now in place a mobile check-in and mobile checkout at the property, and this will, flag to them all the benefits for them of using this, so that you can get them to actually do it when they do receive their email or their text, prompting them to do the mobile check-in and the mobile checkout.
That's great. Thanks, Margot.
Let me see here. We have another question as well. That was partly answered as well by yourself, Tim. Can OTA guests use the mobile check-in?
Yes, and I think I touched on that a little bit in the last question, but we're finding that OTAs are reducing their restrictions on the communication, as long as the communication is focused on mobile check-in. If they see that communication is focused back to the customer on some marketing or trying to grab them directly, they're going to suppress that, or expunge that text, or not allow the communication to go through. But they're allowing the idea of mobile check-in to go through, because they know that this is where the world is going, and that they have to support this. But that will be an ongoing, advocacy with the OTAs to make sure that continues.
Another question here: does this technology alter significantly the process for the front desk agents?
Alter, Margot?
Alter, yes.
Alter. I think what it does is it really just complements. The system is built in such a way that you can choose how much and how many stages you want the guest to go through during the mobile check-in process. If you don't want them to do photo identification, then the front desk ends up being more involved. Or if you want it to be all done on the mobile check-in process, then the front desk agent is less involved. And I think each hotel just can decide how much engagement do you want. So for example, do you want the credit card taken at pre-arrival, or do you want the guest to do everything else but actually come in and do card present in an EMV device at the front desk? So I think those are choices that you would make during, like, looking at your property and then looking at the solution and then sort of customizing it for your needs.
And maybe one more question, as we're getting very close to 10:30. Is there a fully functioning digital key option available?
Yes, I mean, we've gone the route of partnering with a lot of digital key vendors that are out there now, that allow, as soon as the checkout's complete and the room is clean and assigned, that it fires off a link and an SMS or an email to make the key available to the guest. And but there's definitely a whole number of vendors that allow for that right now, that can integrate into this sort of solution.
Thanks, Tim. We definitely do have quite a few more questions, so don't worry, everybody. We're going to be responding them over via email after the webinar, so that everybody gets their questions answered.
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody. I know everyone is very time poor these days and very busy, so I wanted to make this short and sweet, the Reader's Digest webinar. So thank you very much. If I would love it if, before you go, if you're able to fire into the Q&A window or the chat window what you thought of today's webinar and what you'd love to see in a future webinar. We plan to keep doing these and sharing everything we learn with all of you. So thank you very much, and have yourselves a great day.